Thank you for clicking in this video. Are you ready to confront the unknown? Stick around to unravel the mysteries and face the fear that hides in plain sight.
Photography has always been my passion. Capturing moments, freezing time with the click of a shutter, it's more than just a hobby for me. It's an obsession. The way light dances on surfaces, the shadows that stretch across landscapes, every image tells a story, and I pride myself on being able to find those hidden narratives in the most unexpected places. This obsession is what brought me to Calvary Cemetery one chilly October night. Calvary Cemetery, located in Queens, New York, is a vast expanse of history and sorrow. Rows upon rows of tombstones stand like sentinels guarding the memories of those long gone. I had heard stories about the cemetery, tales of strange lights flickering among the gravestones, whispers in the wind that seemed to carry the voices of the dead, and, most famously, the legend of the Bride of Calvary. The legend intrigued me. A young woman, dressed in her wedding gown, died tragically in a carriage accident on the day she was to be married. They say her spirit never left the cemetery where she was buried, doomed to wander among the tombstones, searching for her lost love. It was a story ripe for the telling, and I was determined to capture her elusive image. On that particular night, the sky was overcast, with the moon occasionally breaking through the thick clouds. It was the perfect setting for what I had in mind. Armed with my camera and tripod, I ventured into the cemetery just as the last light of day faded away, leaving the world cloaked in darkness. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves under my boots and the distant hum of the city. Despite the cemetery's proximity to the bustling streets of New York, it felt eerily isolated, as if it existed in a world of its own, a world between the living and the dead. As I set up my equipment, a strange feeling washed over me, a sensation of being watched. I dismissed it as nerves. After all, I was alone in a massive graveyard at night. Anyone would feel uneasy. But this feeling was different, intense, almost suffocating. It felt as though the very air around me was thickening with each passing moment. Ignoring the discomfort, I began to take pictures, focusing on the intricate carvings of the tombstones, the twisted branches of the bare trees, and the occasional statue of an angel or a mourning figure. But my mind kept drifting back to the story of the bride. I wondered if there was any truth to it. Was she really out there, her spirit trapped in an eternal loop of grief? I was just about to pack up and leave when something caught my eye, a movement in the distance, near a cluster of old, weathered graves. I squinted, adjusting my lens, trying to make out what it was. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then I saw it, a figure, faint and almost translucent, moving slowly between the tombstones. My heart raced as I focused the camera on the apparition. There she was, unmistakably dressed in a wedding gown, the fabric glowing faintly in the moonlight. Her face was obscured by a veil, but I could see enough to know that she was beautiful, in a haunting, otherworldly way. I clicked the shutter repeatedly, capturing image after image, my hands shaking with a mix of fear and excitement. But as I continued to photograph her, she seemed to become aware of my presence. She turned slowly, her gaze locking onto mine, even through the lens. I felt a chill run down my spine as our eyes met, or, at least, as much as they could through the veil. For a moment, I was frozen, unable to move or breathe. Then, without warning, she began to glide toward me, her movements smooth and unnaturally fast. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. I had seen enough horror movies to know that running was the worst thing I could do, but instinct took over. I grabbed my camera and bolted for the gate, my pulse pounding in my ears. As I fled, I could feel her presence growing closer, the temperature around me dropping rapidly. I didn't dare look back until I was safely outside the cemetery's iron gates. When I finally turned, panting and trembling, the graveyard was still and silent, the bride nowhere to be seen. I hurried home, my mind reeling from what I had just experienced. Once inside, I locked the door behind me, my heart still racing. It was only then that I realized I had captured something incredible, something that could finally prove the existence of the supernatural. With shaky hands, I connected my camera to my computer, eager to review the images. But as the pictures loaded on the screen, my excitement turned to horror. The photos showed the cemetery, the tombstones, the trees, everything except the bride. She was gone, as if she had never been there at all. And yet, deep down, I knew she was real. I had seen her, felt her presence. And now, I couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen me too, and that she wasn't finished with me yet. The next morning, I woke with a sense of unease that clung to me like a shadow. The memory of the night before was vivid, too vivid to be a mere dream. Yet, the absence of the bride in my photos made me question my sanity. I spent hours staring at those images, scrutinizing every pixel, searching for any sign of her, anything to confirm what I had witnessed. But there was nothing. Frustration and disbelief gnawed at me. How could something so real vanish without a trace? I knew what I saw. I felt her presence, the cold air that had surrounded me, the sheer terror that had gripped my heart. But the evidence refused to back up my claims, leaving me alone with my doubts and fears. Despite the unanswered questions, I couldn't let it go. That night, I found myself drawn back to Calvary Cemetery, compelled by a force I couldn't explain. It was as if the place itself was calling to me, pulling me back into its cold embrace. I told myself it was for the sake of the perfect shot, the one that would finally capture the bride of Calvary and prove the legend true. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I was chasing something beyond a photograph, a truth, perhaps, that I wasn't ready to face. This time, I came prepared. I brought not only my camera, but also a digital recorder, hoping to capture any sounds or voices that might elude the camera's lens. As I entered the cemetery, the night seemed darker, the shadows deeper, as if the very air had thickened with an ominous presence. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. I set up my equipment at the same spot where I had seen the bride the night before. The cemetery was silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant howl of the wind. I started snapping photos, each click of the shutter echoing in the stillness, my heart pounding with anticipation. But the night remained stubbornly ordinary, the bride nowhere to be seen. Hours passed, and the cold seeped into my bones. I was about to give up, frustrated and disappointed, when I heard it, a soft, mournful cry that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably human. I activated the recorder and followed the sound, moving deeper into the cemetery. The cry grew louder, more desperate, as if whoever was making it was in terrible pain. My rational mind screamed at me to leave, to run as far away as possible. But something stronger kept me rooted to the spot, pushing me forward despite the fear that gnawed at my insides. As I rounded a corner, I saw her. The bride was standing between two ancient tombstones, her back to me, her head bowed as if in sorrow. This time, I was certain she was real. The air around her shimmered with an unnatural glow, and the ground beneath her seemed to pulse with a life of its own. I lifted the camera to my eye and pressed the shutter. But before I could take another photo, she turned to face me. The veil still covered her face, but I could feel her eyes boring into mine, filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place: sadness, anger, or perhaps a desperate longing. The cry intensified, echoing through the night, and I realized with a jolt that it was coming from her. She was weeping, her sobs low and guttural, filled with a grief that seemed to resonate deep within my soul. I wanted to reach out, to offer some kind of comfort, but fear kept me rooted in place. Then, without warning, she began to move toward me, her feet gliding over the ground as if she were floating. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward, my camera slipping from my hands and crashing to the ground. But I couldn't take my eyes off her. I was paralyzed, caught in her gaze, unable to move or even scream. As she drew closer, the air grew colder, biting at my skin. I could see the fabric of her gown fluttering in a breeze that didn't exist, her veil rippling like water. And then, just as she was within arm's reach, she stopped. For a moment, we stood there, face to face, though her face remained hidden behind the veil. The weeping had ceased, leaving an eerie silence that pressed down on me like a physical weight. Slowly, she reached out a hand toward me, pale and delicate, but also cold and lifeless. I wanted to flee, but I couldn't move. Her hand was inches from mine when the wind suddenly picked up, howling through the cemetery with a fury that rattled the branches of the trees and sent leaves swirling through the air. The bride's form wavered, flickering like a candle in the wind, and then, in an instant, she was gone. The night returned to its previous stillness, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. Something had changed, something profound and terrifying. The sense of being watched hadn't disappeared, it had intensified. And now, it felt personal, as if I had crossed some invisible line, intruded on something I had no right to see. I gathered my equipment with trembling hands and fled the cemetery, my heart pounding in my chest. But as I reached the gates, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone. The bride had seen me, touched me, and now, I feared, she wouldn't let me go so easily. The following night, I could no longer resist the pull of Calvary Cemetery. The encounter with the bride had left me shaken, but it had also ignited a deep-seated curiosity within me. Who was she? What did she want? And more importantly, why did she appear to me? The questions swirled in my mind, demanding answers. This time, I armed myself with more than just a camera and recorder. I brought a flashlight, extra batteries, and a notebook to document everything. As I crossed the cemetery gates, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping into a different world, one where the boundaries between the living and the dead were blurred, and where anything could happen. The night was eerily quiet as I made my way to the spot where I had last seen the bride. The wind was still, and the usual sounds of the city seemed distant, as if the cemetery existed in a bubble of silence. I turned on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness, casting long, ominous shadows over the gravestones. I reached the clearing and stopped. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the area, half expecting to see her standing there, waiting for me. But the clearing was empty, the tombstones silent witnesses to my anxiety. I took a deep breath and began to explore, moving slowly and deliberately, my senses on high alert. Minutes passed, and the tension in the air grew thicker. The flashlight's beam danced over the graves, picking out the details of weathered stone and tangled ivy. Then, without warning, the air turned icy cold, and the beam of my flashlight flickered. I froze. The sense of being watched returned, stronger than ever. I spun around, my flashlight wavering as I searched the darkness. And then I saw her, a fleeting glimpse of light disappearing behind a row of tombstones. "Wait!" I called out, my voice trembling. I wasn't sure if I was addressing the bride or the fear that gripped me, but I couldn't let her vanish again. I rushed after her, stumbling over the uneven ground, the flashlight bobbing in my hand. I rounded the corner of the tombstones and saw her again, standing a few yards away, her figure faintly illuminated by the moonlight. This time, she wasn't weeping. She stood still, her veil fluttering gently, her posture almost expectant. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my ears. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you here?" The bride didn't respond, but as I got closer, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a faint glow emanating from beneath her veil, as if her face was bathed in a ghostly light. The sight was both mesmerizing and terrifying, and I couldn't look away. I took another step forward, and suddenly, the ground beneath me shifted. I stumbled, nearly losing my balance as the earth gave way, revealing a hidden path that led deeper into the cemetery. The bride turned and began to move down the path, her figure gliding effortlessly over the ground. It was clear she wanted me to follow. I hesitated for only a moment before plunging after her. The path twisted and turned, taking me further from the familiar parts of the cemetery and into an area I hadn't explored before. The tombstones here were older, more weathered, and the trees loomed closer, their branches intertwining overhead, creating a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. Finally, the path opened into a small, secluded clearing, dominated by a large, crumbling mausoleum. The bride stopped in front of it, her form now barely more than a shimmer in the air. The sight of the mausoleum sent a chill down my spine. It was ancient, the stonework cracked and covered in moss, and the iron gate at its entrance hung askew, as if it hadn't been touched in decades. The bride turned to face me, and for the first time, she lifted her veil. I gasped as I saw her face, pale and ethereal, with eyes that glowed like embers. But there was something else in those eyes, something that made my blood run cold: desperation, sorrow, and an unspoken plea for help. Without a word, she pointed to the mausoleum. I understood immediately. Whatever had bound her to this place, whatever had turned her into the restless spirit she was, the answer lay within. My hands trembled as I approached the mausoleum. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, as if the very stones were whispering secrets long buried. I pushed the gate open, the rusty hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The interior was dark and cold, the air heavy with the scent of decay. My flashlight revealed rows of niches, some filled with urns, others with crumbling statues. But what caught my attention was a large stone coffin in the center of the room, its lid slightly ajar. My breath caught in my throat as I approached the coffin. The bride's presence loomed behind me, urging me forward. I hesitated for only a moment before placing my hands on the lid and pushing it open. Inside, I found the remains of a wedding dress, yellowed with age, and a bouquet of wilted flowers clutched in skeletal hands. But it was the small, delicate locket resting on the chest of the skeleton that drew my attention. I picked it up, the metal cold against my skin, and opened it to reveal a faded photograph of a young woman, the bride. I looked back at the spirit, and for the first time, she smiled. It was a sad, wistful smile, but it was also one of gratitude. I realized then that I had uncovered her story, her tragic fate, and perhaps now she could finally find peace. But before I could say anything, the air around me began to stir. The temperature plummeted, and the walls of the mausoleum seemed to close in. The bride's form flickered and began to fade, her smile lingering even as she dissolved into the darkness. Panic surged through me. "Wait! Don't go!" I called out, but it was too late. She was gone, leaving me alone in the cold, empty mausoleum. The sense of loss was overwhelming, but I knew I had done what I could. The bride had shown me her story, and now it was up to me to tell it, to make sure she wasn't forgotten, that her tragic fate was known, and that her spirit could finally rest. As I left the mausoleum, the first light of dawn began to break through the trees, casting long shadows over the cemetery. I knew I would return to this place, not as a photographer chasing a ghost, but as someone who had witnessed a story that needed to be told. The Bride of Calvary had found her way to me, and in doing so, had revealed a world beyond the lens of any camera, a world where the past and the present intertwined, and where the spirits of the forgotten still walked among the living. As the days passed, I found it impossible to shake off the lingering presence of the bride. Her story haunted me, not just in the moments when I was alone, but even in the bustling streets of New York, where the noise and life should have drowned out the whispers of the dead. I knew that I couldn't leave things as they were. There was something unfinished, something left behind in that mausoleum that I had yet to uncover. I returned to Calvary Cemetery one last time, not as a photographer seeking to capture the supernatural, but as a man driven by the need to understand. The morning was shrouded in a thick fog, and the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth. The cemetery, usually alive with the distant sounds of the city, was eerily silent, as if the world itself was holding its breath. As I made my way to the mausoleum, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The tombstones seemed to lean closer, the trees whispering secrets in the wind. But I pressed on, driven by the need to bring closure to the story I had unwittingly become a part of. The mausoleum loomed ahead, its ancient stone walls barely visible through the fog. I pushed open the gate and stepped inside, the cold air wrapping around me like a shroud. The interior was as I had left it, the stone coffin still open, the remains of the wedding dress and the locket undisturbed. But there was something different this time. The air was charged with a strange energy, and I could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and my heart raced as I approached the coffin. I stared down at the locket in my hand, turning it over and over, as if the answers I sought were hidden within its delicate metalwork. The bride's face, frozen in time, stared back at me from the photograph, her eyes filled with a sadness that seemed to reach across the decades. And then, it hit me, the realization that had been just out of reach all along. The bride wasn't the only spirit bound to this place. There was something else, something darker, that had kept her here, trapped in a loop of despair and longing. A shiver ran down my spine as I remembered the old stories, the whispers of a curse that had plagued the cemetery for generations. It was said that those who died tragically, who were taken before their time, could not find peace in Calvary. Their spirits would linger, restless, until someone broke the curse that held them. I looked around the mausoleum, my mind racing. What if the bride wasn't just trying to show me her story? What if she was asking for my help to break the curse? The thought sent a wave of determination through me, banishing the fear that had gripped me since that first night. I knew what I had to do. I knelt beside the coffin, holding the locket close. "I'm here," I whispered, my voice trembling with a mixture of fear and resolve. "I understand now. You're not alone. I'll help you find peace." The air around me grew colder, and for a moment, I thought I saw a faint outline of the bride beside me, her form shimmering in the dim light. Her eyes met mine, and I could see the desperation and hope that had driven her to reach out to me. But before I could say another word, the ground beneath me trembled. The mausoleum shook, dust falling from the ceiling as the very walls seemed to groan under some unseen pressure. Panic surged through me, but I held my ground, clutching the locket tightly. The temperature dropped further, and I could feel a presence all around me, pressing in from every side. It was as if the very spirits of the cemetery had been awakened, drawn to this moment, this act of defiance against the curse that had held them captive for so long. I closed my eyes, focusing on the locket, on the connection I felt with the bride. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," I whispered, my voice steady despite the chaos around me. "I'm here with you. We can end this together." And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the shaking stopped. The air warmed, and the oppressive presence lifted, leaving behind only a sense of calm that I hadn't felt since that first night. I opened my eyes to find the mausoleum bathed in a soft, ethereal light. The bride stood before me, her form more solid now, her face no longer twisted in sorrow but serene, almost peaceful. She smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that brought tears to my eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice like a breeze through the trees. Before I could respond, her form began to fade, dissolving into the light that filled the mausoleum. And then, she was gone, leaving behind only the locket in my hand and the lingering sense of peace that had settled over the cemetery. I stood there for a long time, letting the silence wash over me. The bride was gone, her spirit finally at rest, and I knew that the curse had been broken. The cemetery, once a place of fear and darkness, now felt like a sanctuary, a place where the past and present could coexist in harmony. As I left the cemetery, the fog began to lift, revealing a sky tinged with the soft hues of dawn. I knew I would never forget the bride or the story she had entrusted to me. It was a story that would stay with me for the rest of my life, a reminder of the thin line between the living and the dead, and the power of love and determination to transcend even the most tragic of fates. Leaving the cemetery that morning, I felt a profound sense of closure, but there was also an unease that I couldn't quite shake. The bride's spirit had found peace, but I couldn't help but wonder if there were others, lost souls still wandering Calvary, trapped by the same curse. The thought haunted me as I returned to my apartment, the city's familiar noises gradually pulling me back to the reality of life in New York. Days passed, and I tried to move on, to return to my normal routine. Yet, the experience had changed something deep within me. The photos I had taken no longer held the same allure, and the city's vibrant energy felt almost intrusive after the quietude of the cemetery. But life moved on, and so did I, or so I thought. One evening, as I was reviewing the photos I had taken that night in Calvary, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. In the background of one of the shots, barely visible, was the shadowy outline of a figure, distinct from the bride. It was dark, almost formless, yet undeniably present, a lingering remnant of whatever malevolent force had once kept the bride trapped. My heart raced as I stared at the image, the memories of that night flooding back. I had thought it was over, that the curse had been broken. But this figure, this shadow, seemed to suggest otherwise. Perhaps the bride's story had come to an end, but the cemetery's dark secrets had not yet been fully uncovered. Determined to understand what I had missed, I returned to Calvary one final time. The sun was setting as I arrived, casting long shadows over the tombstones. The cemetery was quiet, almost peaceful, but I knew better now. The tranquility was only a facade, hiding the deeper mysteries that lay beneath. As I walked through the rows of graves, I felt the familiar sensation of being watched. The air grew colder, the wind whispering through the trees with an unnatural urgency. My footsteps echoed in the silence as I made my way back to the mausoleum, the place where it had all begun. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and the cold, musty air greeted me like an old acquaintance. The mausoleum was as I had left it, the coffin still open, the locket lying on the cold stone. But there was something different this time, an oppressive darkness that seemed to seep from the very walls, growing thicker and more tangible with each passing moment. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. "I know you're here," I called out, my voice echoing off the stone walls. "I know there's more to this place. Show yourself." For a moment, nothing happened. The darkness deepened, and I could feel the weight of the centuries pressing down on me. But then, a faint glow appeared in the center of the room, slowly taking shape. It was the bride, her form more translucent than before, her expression serene but tinged with sadness. She didn't speak, but her eyes conveyed a message, a plea that cut through the silence. She wasn't alone in this place. There were others, countless others, still trapped, still bound by the curse that had held her for so long. I understood then what needed to be done. The bride's spirit had been freed, but the curse itself was still alive, still binding the souls of the unfortunate to this place. I had broken part of it, but to truly set them free, I would need to confront the darkness head-on. Holding the locket tightly, I stepped forward, my heart pounding in my chest. "I'm here to end this," I whispered, not just to the bride, but to whatever malevolent force still lurked in the shadows. "I'll help you all find peace." The glow around the bride intensified, and I felt a surge of energy unlike anything I had experienced before. The darkness recoiled, retreating from the light, but it wasn't gone. It was gathering, preparing for one final confrontation. The walls of the mausoleum began to shake, and I could feel the ground trembling beneath my feet. The air crackled with energy, and I could see faint outlines of other spirits emerging from the shadows, drawn to the bride's light. They were all around me now, men, women, children, all bound to this place by the same curse. "I'm not afraid of you," I said, my voice strong and clear. "This ends now." The darkness surged forward, a wave of malevolent energy that threatened to overwhelm me. But I stood my ground, focusing on the locket, on the connection I had with the bride and the spirits around me. I could feel their strength, their determination to break free, flowing through me. And then, with a blinding flash of light, the darkness shattered. The mausoleum filled with a radiant glow, and I felt a warmth wash over me, a sense of peace and relief that was almost overwhelming. The spirits began to fade, one by one, their forms dissolving into the light as they finally found the release they had been denied for so long. The bride was the last to go. She looked at me one final time, her expression one of gratitude and peace, before she too faded into the light. The locket in my hand grew warm, and I knew that it had finally served its purpose. As the light dimmed, the mausoleum returned to its usual silence. But the oppressive weight, the sense of darkness and despair, was gone. The curse had been broken, and the spirits of Calvary were finally at rest. I left the cemetery that night with a sense of fulfillment, knowing that I had done the right thing. The bride's story, and those of the other spirits, had come to an end, but their memories would live on. Calvary Cemetery would no longer be a place of fear and despair, but a place of peace and remembrance. And as I walked away, the city lights in the distance guiding me home, I knew that I, too, had been changed. The experience had left its mark on me, but it was a mark I would carry with pride, a reminder that even in the darkest places, there is always the possibility of redemption.
What did you think of this story? Was it everything you expected, or did it take you by surprise? Now, let's dive into the second story and uncover even more of the unknown.
The first time I heard about the lake hidden deep within the Appalachian Mountains, it was from an old friend who had always been fascinated by local myths and legends. We were sitting in a dimly lit bar in Asheville, the kind of place where stories are traded like currency, and the weight of history hangs heavy in the air. He spoke of the lake with a reverence that bordered on fear, his voice dropping to a whisper as he recounted the tales that had been passed down through generations. "They say the water's black as night," he said, his eyes narrowing as if he could see it in his mind. "Quiet, too, like it's holding its breath. But it's not the water that gets you. It's the song." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "The song?" He nodded, leaning closer. "People who camp near the lake, they hear this melody, something that shouldn't exist in a place like that. It's beautiful, haunting, but once you hear it, you can't ignore it. You're drawn to the water, and if you're not careful, you end up walking right in. They never find the bodies." I laughed, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. "Sounds like a ghost story." "Maybe," he replied, but there was no humor in his voice. "But it's real enough that folks around here avoid that place. They call it the Black Waters, and they know better than to camp too close." I thought about his words for days after that conversation, the idea of a song luring people to their doom gnawing at my curiosity. I had spent years studying local legends, writing about them, trying to separate fact from fiction. The more I thought about the Black Waters, the more it seemed like just another myth, until I started digging deeper. I found scattered references in old journals, stories of settlers who spoke of the lake with a mixture of awe and dread. Some called it cursed, others claimed it was a portal to another world, a place where the boundaries between our reality and something else grew thin. The stories were always the same. Those who heard the song were never seen again. It wasn't long before I decided I needed to see the place for myself. There was something about the mystery that drew me in, a need to understand what lay beneath the surface. I packed my gear, camera, recorder, a notebook filled with hastily scribbled notes, and set out for the mountains. The hike was grueling, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The trail, if you could call it that, was little more than a narrow path winding through dense forest, the kind of place where the outside world felt distant and unreal. I didn't see another soul the entire way up, the only sounds my own footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. When I finally reached the lake, I was struck by how ordinary it seemed at first glance. The water was still, almost unnaturally so, its surface reflecting the overcast sky like a mirror. The trees around it stood tall and silent, their branches hanging low as if in mourning. There was no wind, no birdsong, just an oppressive quiet that seemed to stretch on forever. But as I stood there, something changed. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, a faint sound carried on the air, like the distant echo of a melody. I couldn't place it, couldn't tell if it was coming from the water or the trees or somewhere else entirely. It was beautiful, though, in a way that made my skin prickle with unease. I tried to focus, to capture the sound with my recorder, but the closer I listened, the more it seemed to slip away, just out of reach. I found myself stepping closer to the water, my heart pounding in my chest, the song growing louder with each step. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the melody stopped. The silence rushed back in, thicker and more suffocating than before. I stood there, frozen, my eyes fixed on the black water, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But there was nothing. Just the quiet, and the feeling that I wasn't alone. I forced myself to turn away, to take a step back from the edge. The rational part of my mind screamed at me to leave, to get as far away from this place as possible. But something else, something deeper, told me that I had to stay, that I had only scratched the surface of the truth. I made camp a short distance from the lake, my nerves on edge as I set up my tent. The night fell quickly in the mountains, the darkness swallowing the last traces of daylight. As I settled in, the silence pressed in around me, heavy and unnerving. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The memory of the song echoed in my mind, a haunting refrain that refused to fade. And as I lay there, staring up at the fabric of my tent, I knew that the worst was yet to come. The next morning, I awoke to a world shrouded in fog, the air thick and damp, as if the lake itself had exhaled a breath of cold mist overnight. The trees loomed like specters, their outlines blurred, and the water remained as still as ever, an expanse of inky blackness that seemed to swallow the light. The melody from the previous night still echoed in my mind, a ghostly refrain that refused to let go. It was as if the song had rooted itself deep within me, a lingering presence that I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried. I found myself drawn to the water's edge again, the pull of the lake stronger than before. As I stood there, staring into the abyss, I couldn't help but wonder about the stories I'd heard. The idea that the lake was a portal to another dimension seemed absurd, yet there was something about this place that defied logic. The stillness, the silence, the way the water seemed to drink in the light and sound, it was as if the lake was alive, waiting. I spent the day exploring the area around the lake, hoping to find some clue, some explanation for the eerie atmosphere that hung over the place. But the more I searched, the more the forest seemed to close in around me, the trees crowding together like a barrier between me and the outside world. I found nothing, no signs of life, no birds, no animals, not even the smallest insect. The place was a void, a black hole in the heart of the mountains where time seemed to stand still. As the day wore on, the fog lifted, revealing the full extent of the lake. It was larger than I had imagined, stretching out in all directions, with no visible end. The water was so dark that it looked like oil, thick and viscous, reflecting the sky like a pool of liquid night. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from beneath the surface, something ancient and patient, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Every ripple, every shift in the light, made me jump, my nerves frayed from the tension that had built up inside me. By the time the sun began to set, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I returned to my campsite, the weight of the day pressing down on me. As the darkness crept in, the quiet of the lake grew even more oppressive, the silence broken only by the sound of my own breathing. I tried to distract myself by reviewing my notes, but the words blurred on the page, my thoughts consumed by the memory of the song. It had been so faint, so elusive, yet it had left an indelible mark on me. I found myself humming the tune under my breath, the melody hauntingly familiar despite only having heard it once. It was then that I noticed something strange. My voice wasn't alone. There was another sound, barely perceptible at first, harmonizing with my own. I stopped, my heart skipping a beat as I listened. The song was back, but this time it was clearer, louder, as if it were coming from the water itself. I scrambled out of my tent, my pulse racing. The lake was still there, as black and silent as ever, but the song was unmistakable now, a siren's call that seemed to rise from the depths. It was beautiful, mesmerizing, and utterly terrifying. I stood there, paralyzed by the sound, feeling its pull like a physical force. It wrapped around me, drawing me closer to the water, my feet moving on their own. The melody was intoxicating, promising something just out of reach, something that I had to see, to experience. But as I neared the water's edge, a flash of fear cut through the haze. I forced myself to stop, my legs trembling as I fought against the compulsion to step into the lake. The water was so close, the song so sweet, but something deep inside me screamed that if I gave in, there would be no turning back. I staggered away, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The song faded, the silence crashing back in like a wave. I collapsed onto the ground, my body shaking with the effort of resisting the pull of the lake. Whatever was down there, whatever was calling to me, it wasn't human. It was something far older, far more powerful, and it wanted me. As I lay there, staring up at the darkening sky, I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't stay here. The lake had its hooks in me, and if I didn't leave soon, I might never leave at all. But even as I made that decision, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late. And somehow, I had become part of his world, drawn into the shadows that he had painted and brought to life. The whispers returned that night, louder and more insistent than ever. They seemed to be coming from all around me, echoing off the walls, seeping into my mind. They were no longer just background noise. They were voices, speaking in hushed, frantic tones. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but I knew they were talking about me, warning me. I tried to block them out, but they only grew louder, more aggressive. The cold in the apartment became unbearable, a freezing chill that cut through my clothes and seeped into my bones. It was as if the very air was turning against me, trying to drive me out. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. I had to figure out how to break whatever curse was binding Green to this place. I had to free him, and in doing so, free myself. The next morning, I returned to the library, desperate for answers. I pored over every record I could find, looking for anything that might explain Green's disappearance or the dark power that seemed to emanate from his paintings. Finally, I stumbled upon an old journal entry from one of Green's contemporaries, another artist who had lived in the same building. The entry was brief, but it mentioned something that sent a shiver down my spine. Green had been obsessed with the idea of capturing souls in his art. He believed that by painting a person, he could trap their spirit in the canvas, binding them to his work forever. The other artist had dismissed it as madness, but after Green's disappearance, he had started to wonder if there was some truth to it. I knew then what I had to do. Green's spirit wasn't just haunting the apartment, it was tied to his paintings, particularly The Watcher. If I could destroy the painting, I might be able to break the curse and free him. But it wouldn't be easy. I had no idea where the original painting was, or if it even still existed. I would have to start by destroying the replica I had found online, the one that had brought me into this nightmare in the first place. With renewed determination, I set out to find the tools I needed. The whispers followed me every step of the way, growing louder as if they knew what I was planning. But I didn't let them deter me. I had come too far to turn back now. The weight of what I was about to do pressed heavily on my chest as I prepared to destroy the replica of the Watcher. Every fiber of my being screamed that this was my only chance to break free from the terrifying grip of Arthur Green's lingering presence. The whispers, now constant and maddening, seemed to mock my efforts, growing in intensity as I approached the painting. I had gathered every tool I could think of, a hammer, a chisel, even a lighter, but none of them seemed adequate against the malevolent force I could feel radiating from the image on my screen. The figure in the painting, still facing away, seemed to be waiting for me, as if daring me to try. As I stood there, hammer in hand, I realized how foolish this all seemed. I was about to attack a digital image, something that shouldn't hold any power over me. Yet, deep down, I knew this was no ordinary picture. It was the key to everything that had happened in the apartment, the source of the cold dread that had seeped into my life since I had moved in. With a deep breath, I swung the hammer down onto the screen. The glass shattered, cracks spiderwebbing across the image, but the figure in the painting remained unchanged, unmoved by the destruction. I stared in disbelief as the whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices swirling around me, each one laced with fear and desperation. Suddenly, a gust of icy wind blew through the apartment, extinguishing the lights and plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for the lighter, my hands shaking as I tried to ignite it. A small flame flickered to life, casting eerie shadows across the walls. That's when I saw it, green shadowy form emerging from the corner, more solid and menacing than ever before. He was no longer just a figure in a painting. He was here, in my apartment, his presence overwhelming the room with an oppressive weight. I could feel his cold eyes on me, even though his face was still turned away. The whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar, drowning out my thoughts, as if they were trying to tear my mind apart. In a panic, I grabbed the broken pieces of the screen and threw them at the figure, desperate to banish it. But Green didn't flinch. Instead, he began to turn, slowly revealing his face. I knew I couldn't let him complete the motion. I had to act now, or it would be too late. Recalling the journal entry about Green's belief in capturing souls, I realized that the only way to truly end this was to confront him directly. I needed to face the terror head-on, to break whatever bond was holding him to this place. With nothing left to lose, I stepped toward him, holding the lighter up as if it could protect me. "Arthur Green!" I shouted, my voice trembling but resolute. "This is not your home anymore. You have to let go." For a moment, everything went silent. The whispers stopped, the cold receded, and Green's shadowy form seemed to waver. I could feel the tension in the air, as if the very fabric of reality was stretching, ready to snap. But just as quickly as it had stopped, the pressure returned tenfold. Green's form solidified, and with a final, horrific twist, he fully faced me. His face was a twisted, tortured mask of rage and despair, eyes hollow yet burning with a terrifying intensity. The sight of it froze me in place, my courage evaporating in an instant. The whispers resumed, this time not in my ears, but in my mind, gnawing at my sanity. I felt like I was being pulled into his world, into the darkness that had consumed him. But then, just as I was about to succumb, something broke through the noise, a memory, fleeting but powerful, of the life I had before all this madness. It was enough. I gathered every ounce of strength I had left and lunged at Green's figure, forcing the lighter's flame toward him. The fire met his form, and for a brief second, I felt resistance, as if I was pushing against something solid. Then, with a flash of blinding light, Green's form exploded into a cloud of ash and smoke, dissipating into the air. The whispers ceased immediately, replaced by an eerie silence. The cold that had pervaded the apartment lifted, leaving behind only the normal chill of a New York night. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my ears. It was over. Green was gone. I looked around the apartment, half expecting something else to jump out at me, but everything was still. I broke the surface with a gasp, the cold air shocking my lungs. The lake was thrashing like a storm had hit, the water churning violently. I swam for shore, my muscles screaming with exhaustion, and dragged myself onto the bank just as the lake stilled once more. The song was gone. The lake was quiet. And I was alive. But I knew this wasn't over yet. Whatever I had unleashed was still down there, waiting. The lake's surface was calm, eerily still, as if the storm had never happened. The night was pitch black, and the only sounds were my labored breathing and the occasional rustle of leaves in the distance. My body ached from the struggle, but I couldn't afford to rest. I knew, deep down, that whatever I had disturbed in the depths of that lake wasn't going to let me go so easily. I stared at the water, waiting for any sign that the rift might reopen, that the nightmare would start again. But all I could see was my own reflection, pale and ghostly in the moonlight. I thought about the song, the way it had wormed its way into my mind, compelling me to dive deeper and deeper into the darkness. Even now, with the silence hanging heavy in the air, I could still feel its lingering presence, a dull echo at the edge of my thoughts. I knew I had to destroy the rift completely. Whatever ancient force lay beyond it, whatever had been using the song to lure people to their doom, needed to be sealed away for good. I couldn't leave this place knowing that others might fall victim to the same fate. But how? The salt water had temporarily disrupted the rift, but it hadn't closed it entirely. I needed something more, something permanent. I reached into my bag, pulling out the few remaining items I had brought with me. Among them was a small bundle of sage, a relic of my previous investigations into the supernatural. I had used it in rituals to cleanse haunted spaces, to banish malevolent spirits. Perhaps it could help me now. With the sage in hand, I made my way back to the water's edge. The thought of diving into that inky blackness again filled me with dread, but I had no choice. If I didn't finish this, the lake's curse would continue to claim more lives. I took a deep breath and waded into the water once more. It was even colder than before, sending a shock through my system. The weight of what I was about to do pressed down on me, but I couldn't hesitate. I had to see this through. I swam out to the center of the lake, the spot where I had first discovered the rift. The water was quiet now, the song completely silenced. But I could feel a subtle pull, as if the lake itself was trying to draw me back to the depths. I knew the rift was still there, just beneath the surface, waiting. I lit the sage, the small flame flickering in the damp air, and whispered a quiet prayer, a plea for protection, for strength. Then, with one final breath, I plunged beneath the surface. The water closed in around me, the darkness absolute. My flashlight cut a narrow beam through the blackness, guiding me downward. I swam deeper and deeper, the pressure building in my ears, until I saw the faint glow of the rift in the distance. It was still there, pulsing with that eerie, otherworldly light. I approached cautiously, the sage burning steadily in my hand, the smoke trailing behind me like a spectral veil. The rift seemed to sense my presence, the light growing brighter as I neared. The water around it began to churn, and I could see the shadows darting in and out of the rift, the same dark shapes I had glimpsed before. This was it, the final confrontation. I had no idea what would happen when I released the sage, whether it would be enough to seal the rift or if it would unleash something far worse. But I couldn't turn back now. I reached out, holding the burning sage above the rift, and released it. The sage drifted downward, its embers glowing like tiny stars in the water. The moment it touched the rift, the light flared, blindingly bright, and the water erupted around me. I was thrown backward, tumbling through the blackness as the rift began to close. The light intensified, a brilliant white that filled my vision, and the song returned, louder than ever, a piercing wail that reverberated through my skull. I screamed, the sound lost in the water, as I was pulled toward the closing rift. I fought against it, kicking and thrashing, but the current was too strong. Just when I thought I would be dragged into the rift, it sealed shut with a deafening crack. The light vanished, plunging me into total darkness, and the song cut off abruptly, leaving me in silence. The rift was gone. The lake was still. And I was alive. I swam back to the surface, my body trembling with exhaustion. As I broke through the water and gulped in the cold night air, I knew the curse had been broken. The song would never lure anyone into the lake again. But as I dragged myself onto the shore and collapsed on the ground, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out of that rift. Something ancient and malevolent. The lake was silent now, but in the back of my mind, I could still hear a faint, distant echo of the song, like a memory that refused to fade. The nightmare was over, or so I hoped. But as I stared out at the calm, black waters of the lake, I couldn't help but wonder, had I truly sealed the rift? Or had I merely awakened something far worse? The night air was still and heavy as I lay on the shore, gasping for breath. The lake, once a mirror of darkness, now seemed strangely serene. The rift was gone, the song silenced, and the nightmare that had nearly claimed me was, for now, a memory fading into the background. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, lurking just out of sight. I struggled to my feet, my body aching from the ordeal, and scanned the shoreline. Everything appeared as it should. The trees were still, the moon hung low in the sky, and the water was calm. But something felt off, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. I had come here seeking answers, drawn by the mystery of the lake and the ancient song that had lured so many to their deaths. I had found more than I bargained for, an encounter with something beyond human comprehension. The rift was closed, but the echoes of that otherworldly melody still haunted me. I could feel it, like a faint hum in the back of my mind, refusing to be silenced. I knew I couldn't stay here. The lake was quiet now, but I wasn't naive enough to believe that I had one. Whatever lived in those dark waters, whatever ancient force had sung that deadly tune, was still out there, waiting. I had disrupted its plans, but I hadn't destroyed it. I had only bought time. I gathered my things, my hands trembling as I packed up my gear. Every rustle of leaves, every whisper of wind, sent a jolt of fear through me. I needed to leave, to put as much distance between myself and this cursed place as possible. But even as I hurriedly threw my bag over my shoulder, I knew the lake would never truly let me go. As I started to walk away, I felt a strange pull, like a magnetic force drawing me back. I hesitated, glancing over my shoulder at the water. The surface was smooth, reflecting the pale light of the moon. For a moment, it was almost beautiful, serene in its deceptive calm. But I knew better. The lake had taken many lives, ensnaring them with its hypnotic song, dragging them into the abyss. I had come dangerously close to joining them, and now, even as I walked away, I felt its presence tugging at the edges of my consciousness. I forced myself to keep moving, each step feeling heavier than the last. The forest around me was quiet, unnervingly so, and the darkness seemed to press in from all sides. I focused on the path ahead, trying to ignore the gnawing sense of dread in my gut. But then, just as I reached the edge of the woods, I heard it. A faint melody, soft and haunting, drifted through the air. It was barely audible, more of a sensation than a sound, but I recognized it immediately, the song of the lake. The very same tune that had lured countless souls to their doom. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The rational part of my mind screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But the song, it was so beautiful, so alluring. It called to me, a siren's whisper promising secrets and wonders beyond imagination. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. This was exactly how it started, how the lake ensnared its victims. But I wasn't going to let it happen again. I had faced the darkness once, and I had survived. I could do it again. But as I took a step forward, the song grew louder, more insistent. I could feel it tugging at my mind, pulling me back toward the water. My vision blurred, the world around me fading into shadows as the melody wrapped around me like a velvet shroud. "No!" I shouted, the sound tearing from my throat as I fought against the compulsion. I dug my nails into my palms, the sharp pain grounding me in reality. I wasn't going to let the lake win. Not now, not ever. With a final surge of willpower, I broke free of the song's grip and sprinted down the path, the trees blurring past me as I ran. The song faded, replaced by the pounding of my own heartbeat, and the world slowly came back into focus. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of my car, parked at the edge of the forest. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and locked it. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, but I managed to start the engine and peel away from the cursed lake. As I drove, the memories of what had happened replayed in my mind. The rift, the song, the ancient force lurking beneath the water, it all seemed so surreal, like a nightmare that I couldn't fully wake up from. But it was real, and I knew that I had barely escaped with my life. The further I got from the lake, the more the tension in my body eased. The song was gone, the darkness behind me. But I knew, deep down, that this wasn't the end. The lake was still out there, waiting. And the song would find me again. But not tonight. Tonight, I had survived. And that was enough. As I drove away into the night, the lake faded into the distance, becoming just another shadow in the rearview mirror. But the memory of that haunting melody would stay with me forever, a reminder of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface. And in the quiet moments, when the world was still and the night was at its darkest, I would remember the song of the black waters and the terrible, beautiful lure of the unknown.
If you want to watch another story, there is another video appearing on your screen now. Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more spine-chilling stories.